Say again?
Hey, how you doing, buddy? This here's Carl from Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm here talking on my CB.
On the CB yet?
Yeah, Breaker 19. Did you ever drive an 18-wheeler?
No.
You never drove an 18-wheeler?
No way.
Oh, boy.
You got to have a special license to drive an 18-wheeler.
I know that your license is playing big band music on the Buddy Verdi Show.
That's the Buddy Verdi Show. Big band music every Saturday afternoon from 1 until 3 here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Good, buddy. It's Word of God Ministries with Pastor Danny Zico. Saturday night from 10 until midnight. Preaching the Word of God with Pastor Danny Zico and Word of God Ministries.
To be touched, to be restored, to be healed, and to be forgiven, God, and to come back into your love and mercy. We thank you, Tati, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank the Lord for you guys.
Word of God Ministries with Pastor Danny Zico. Saturday night from 10 until midnight here on the Tan Talk Radio Network.
From the Sunshine State, this is Tampa Bay's Tan Talk.
It's now time for the fastest and hardest hitting hour in radio, Pull No Punches Radio. Pull No Punches Radio is powered by the Enlisted Nine Fight Company and brought to you exclusively by the Tan Talk Radio Network. Join us for the next hour as we deliver up-to-the-second news, rumors, and topic discussions from the world of mixed martial arts and sports while truly pulling no punches. Feel free to give us a call now at 727-441-3000 or toll free at 866-826-1340. Now, here are your hosts of Pull No Punches Radio, Ultimate Fighter Season 16 winner Colt Smith, Enlisted Nine Fight Company founder Dan O'Brien, and media mogul Jay Pagliaro.
I wish I knew then what I know right now. When my parents fled, that's when it shook my ground. No source of strength now, my life was unclear. Cracks in the foundation, I was living in fear. Paycheck to paycheck, 3 jobs at a time. Woo! Mom tried, I watched her crying, not receiving a dime. My father was gone, he was doing his thing. As the years went by, my phone would ring. Played outside every day.
Good morning, Tampa Bay, and welcome to the Championship Weekend edition of Pull No Punches Radio, powered by the Enlisted Nine Fight Company. I am Jay Pagliaro, Dan O'Brien, my co-host. Also joining us as co-host on a weekly basis, UFC legend, MMA legend, the man who had more fight of the night bonuses than most people have fights in this sport. Of course, the one and only Chris Lights Out Lytle. Gentlemen, how you doing today?
Doing great.
Hey, I'm on the line. I'm doing great, too. It's glad to have you back, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me again. I love being on the show.
Awesome. Well, as you know, every week, Chris, Dan, and I come on here, and we give you the best in MMA. We give you the best in sports. We give you the best of topics in all worlds. Today going to be no different. Just a quick synopsis of what we're going to discuss tonight. Obviously, UFC Fight Night was earlier this week in Atlanta, Georgia, or the Atlanta surrounding area. Chris had one of his fighters on there, Garrett Whitley. We'll talk a little bit about that card. The ongoing saga between the UFC and George St. Pierre. This one a little bit unfortunate. We're going to give some perspective on this. I especially can't wait to get Chris's perspective because, again, you know what? He's been in there. He's been on both sides of the angle, so we're going to get his thoughts on that. Also, a possible Brock Lesnar return to the UFC. And, of course, we've got Sunday here in the NFL. We'll break down all the games and recap the ones that happened last week. Your telephone number to call. Toll free, 866-826-1340 or 727-441-3000. Now, first and foremost, first topic we want to discuss, again, Wednesday night, Atlanta, Georgia, UFC Fight Night. We saw several big fights. Obviously, the main event we saw Luke Rockhold defeat Kostas Philippou. The fighter we're going to talk about, Chris, involved your fighter, Garrett Whitley, had a hard-fought decision against a very tough Vince Pichel. What did you take out of that fight, Chris? You got the corner of Garrett. You got to, see Garrett do work. What do you think Garrett took out of this fight, and how do you think he made improvements as a result of it?
Well, I mean, Garrett showed a lot of heart in that fight. He showed me just certain things that you really can't judge because this is the first fight going the distance. He's had 8 pro fights before that. None of them have went past. I think he went to the 3rd round one time, but he was able to submit that guy in the 3rd round. Most of them have been in the 1st round, so this is just a different level that he's competing at now. So it was just a little bit different. He had a couple good submission attempts, and the thing that really impressed me was he was losing the fight, and there was less than a minute to go to the fight, and he was still making a couple good attempts, had a good armbar attempt. He was just kind of overpowered during a lot of the match, and once again, if you're not used to competing at that level, I think he had a lot of more local fights, and then he kind of jumped right up to the UFC, which is the best of the best. So I think he learned a lot about the difference between people fighting. He's been fighting at the local level and at that level. So I wouldn't mind seeing him get a couple, not necessarily local fights, but maybe some just regional fights, just really, really tough, high-level fights, just not quite UFC. Get used to that a little bit, and maybe make another go with UFC. So I think he learned that he has, the endurance and knows how to fight and has the skills. He just has to kind of be in a tough fight situation more often.
Now, one thing that was nice about Garrett, we saw his 2 fights in the UFC. We saw exponential improvement, in my opinion, from his debut in the promotion to his fight with Pichel. But you think from here, Chris, it's back to the regional scene for him?
Well, I don't know about. I'm not necessarily regional. That seems like too much like a local. I want him to fight, very tough competition. We're talking about maybe sending him to the Bama over in London. Maybe something, just get him on an airplane, being like a big fight in a big organization, just not quite UFC right now, because that is the biggest and the best organization there is. So I'd like to see him fight somewhere outside of it a time or two, cut his teeth there a little bit, do pretty well, and come back with a newfound respect for the level of competition there, and just do some good things.
Awesome. Now, throwing it out there to you, I mean, Bellator, would that be something that Garrett, would that be the type of level that you think Garrett could, would be something you'd explore, or maybe a World Series of Fighting?
You know what, Series of Fighting, I would kind of avoid Bellator because, to be honest, I think what they're going to try and do is lock people up on contracts that are going to keep him, away from the UFC, and that's not really my goal. I would rather see him competing in the UFC, and I think he'll be able to do that. It's just getting a few more fights where you're going to have to fight tough guys and go those 3-round wars. That's what I really want. I want someone to go through and have to add a couple really tough fights like that where they understand exactly how to pace yourself and how sore you're going to be, and there's the whole mental aspect of going 3 tough rounds.
Awesome. You guys are tuned in to Pull No Punches Radio here on the Tan Talk Radio Network, also on TuneIn Radio. Be sure to give us a call if you're interested in discussing MMA with Chris Lytle, Dan O'Brien of the Enlisted Nine Fight Company, and myself at 866-826-1340 or 727-441-3000. Now, the main event of this card, as we mentioned at the very beginning, Chris and Dan, we saw Luke Rockhold pick up his first victory in the UFC, beat a very tough Kostas Philippou. The biggest thing I took out of this is that, to me, it's not how you look when you win. It's how you rebound from a loss. And make no bones about it, Rockhold had a devastating loss in his UFC debut to a very tough top 2 Vitor Belfort. Question I throw out to you, gentlemen, and Dan, lead us off here. What does this win do to solidify, so to speak, Rockhold as a possible top contender in the middleweight division? And what do you think he takes out of this fight? What do you think he takes out of this win, and where do you think he goes from here?
I think just simply, in my opinion, I think he gets his confidence back. He came in out of Strikeforce looking very well. He took out Tim Kennedy, as you know, a big fight before he came over. And Tim Kennedy now is, I think, number 9 ranked in the 85ers. So I think he's back on track. And I think Dana is excited about having him in there because, like we had this talk yesterday, is that 85 is a little thin past 10. So I think it brings another guy right back into the mix.
So now, Chris, what do you think? What do you think that this win did? Do you think this win solidifies Rockhold as a top 10, maybe 5 middleweight?
I mean, I don't know if this win really does that. I think, it shows he's taking steps in the right direction. But I got to tell you, I was actually there at the fight, and I never really stood next to Luke before, but just seeing him right before he got in the cage, I was standing pretty close to him. I said, this guy is a monster. I didn't realize how big, how strong, and how athletic this guy is. And you could really tell when you saw the fight. I mean, Philippou wanted nothing to do. Anything he threw to hurt that guy. He could have probably thrown a kick and it would have missed, and it still would have almost knocked him down. This guy is he's a physical beast. I think he does have all the tools, and I think, you will see in the future just how good this guy is. I'm not real sure if this fight is, because you didn't get to see that much besides everything he threw looked like, he's going to knock his opponent out with that punch, or that kick. So I really look forward to seeing him fighting. I think he is he's definitely a legitimate fighter, and he can be up there at the top tier. I just want to see him fight somebody else to really deserve what what we're saying about him right now, because I think he's going to be there.
Well, Chris, who do you think's a good matchup for him next?
I don't know. Right after the fight, I think he was really wanting to go back after Vitor pretty soon. So I wouldn't mind seeing that again. I'm not real sure if I don't think people really understand how the first time in UFC, people are starstruck. People aren't really ready. Nobody really fights their best their first fight in the UFC. So I think coming right out there, maybe things got to him. Maybe the pressure was there. Maybe he didn't perform the way he wanted to. So I'd like to see him come back and have another fight and see if he can do a little better on the second time, and I assure you he will.
Well, he said that he called out Michael Bisping, but there's a lot of guys that Tim Kennedy keeps calling out Bisping too. So I think with the Belfort fight coming up here, with the championship title, I think he's going to try to either lock on to like a Munoz, or maybe he's going to lock on to somebody like a Michael Bisping.
Yeah, he's definitely. A lot of people are wanting to find Michael Bisping. I've heard his name thrown around several times, so he's going to have to get in line for that. We're not real sure. I wouldn't be surprised if the UFC would put that on, because that'd be an intriguing matchup. So you get the conflicting styles, but they're both going to be there to try and do a lot of stand-up, and it'd be a very interesting fight.
Name I'm going to throw out there, and he's not top 10 yet, but the way he's been fighting in his UFC career, 3 fights, he's had 3 knockouts, and just had an emphatic comeback this week in Atlanta. I'm going to throw out the name of Yoel Romero. I mean, again, not a top 10 guy right now. I can't help but believe he's right on that cusp of that. I think that'd be an interesting style matchup. You got an Olympic wrestler, in Romero, who just throws absolute nightmarish strikes, taking on Rockhold, who's a very shifty and, hard-handed striker. So that could be an interesting matchup I'm throwing out there as well. And speaking of the UFC, real quick public service announcement, UFC coming to Orlando in the month of April. Any businesses listening to this, you want to do a live remote broadcast, bring Chris Lytle, Dan O'Brien, the Enlisted 9 Fight Company, and myself out, feel free to hit us up online at Enlisted 9 Fight Company on Facebook, and we'll make out some kind of arrangement. We'll get Chris Lytle, we'll all get out there, we'll do a live remote broadcast, and get to meet one of the top fighters in MMA history, Chris Lights Out Lytle. Now, speaking of top fighters in UFC history, obviously we'd be remiss, Chris and Dan, if we didn't start out by talking a little bit about what's going on with the situation with George St. Pierre in the UFC. Now, I'm going to avoid discussion about, the drug testing battle that's going on back and forth between the two, because I want to get more details and more insight as to what's going on before I make any rash calls and, sound pretty rough on here. But I do want to bring up the 2 topics that GSP's really brought to the forefront as his concerns. Number 1, that of course being the monopoly, and number 2 being fighter pay. Now, Chris, from your perspective, okay, we're talking about fighter pay. These guys that come into the UFC, just as their entry-level fight, they make 8-8, 10-10. I mean, it's come a long way. People don't understand it's come a long way, even from when you started out in the UFC and when you were fighting. Give your perspective on what GSP's saying on this, on the pay scale of the UFC, if you could, please.
I mean, I understand what he's saying, and everybody thinks, they deserve more, but one thing we're talking about here is when I first started fighting, what you said, you're making 8-8, 10-10 right now. My first fight, I got $500 when I fought in the UFC. And that was a very depressing realization when I was like, this is the pinnacle of the sport. I made $500 for the fight. Wow, things have to change. I waited a couple of years. I came back and I made, 2,000, 2-2. I mean, it was just, that's all there was. I mean, the sport is definitely going in the right direction. Just take some time. People don't get that. Everybody wants to compare, the paydays to UFC fighting as to boxing. Boxing, first of all, has been around for well over 100 years, but despite that, the people in boxing don't make what they think they do either. The top tier guys, yes, you got the Floyd Mayweathers and you got people like them. They're making all the money. I've been on some of these big pro boxing match cards. The guys who might be very, very good fighters, you might have a record of 14-1, you might be fighting for $1,000, so they don't understand. They don't understand those lower level. The UFC, the top tier guys, they don't get paid as much, but the mid-level, entry-level guys on the undercard, they're making a ton more money than most boxers are. People don't seem to understand that fact. And just understand the fact that the sport is still growing. and the fighter pays are coming up, it's a totally different animal than what they're kind of really understanding. Everybody thinks I deserve this and I deserve that. But if you do something like this, you have the UFC who's trying to do a lot to promote the sport and grow it in several different areas, different countries right now. So you try and take too much money away from them, you can't grow the sport anymore. You're really cutting your own, your throat for the future. So it's kind of a catch-22. I understand people think they deserve more money and they want more money, but at the same time, the business has to be able to be profitable, make enough money to do all these other projects they want to do to help the growth of the sport. Most people aren't to have those opportunities they are having right now.
Well, I mean, throw this out there. Even the Robbie Lawler fight, which is widely considered one of the better fights in MMA history, did you make what these guys are making just the entry level in that fight?
Man, I got $1,800 after all things were said and done. After my cornerman's fees and I got $1,800. And I after that fight, they asked me to fight again. Well, I had to go out to the UFC and fight another fight. And then when I won that, they asked me to come back to the UFC. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. Once again, they said, well, your pay is going to be 2-2, 2,000 to 2,000. And I remember I was like, no, I'm not taking that. I just fought for 2-2. I lost a very close fight. I need a little bit more money than that. I was trying, and they're like, no, we'll give you 2-2. And I was like, oh, I'm not doing it. And they're like, okay. And I remember it's like I hung up the phone and I sat there for a few minutes and I was like, well, what am I doing? I called them back and said, I'll take it for 2-2. I mean, there's just that. I understand the fact. I've helped run businesses. I've been involved with that, and if that's all that I can afford to pay for that fight and still make money, that's what you have to do. So I understand people might say I deserve 10-10. You might deserve it, but that's not realistic what you can get paid. So they're going to make their money one way or the other, and they're going to get somebody to take that fight. It's basically the fighter has to go out there and show that they're worth it, and then they will get paid more. I guarantee it. They're going to get paid. Somebody will pay you, and there could be a competition or a bid between who's going to pay the most to this guy because this guy's in high demand. So that's the way it's supposed to work. The free market is supposed to work, and it usually does.
Now, just from what you even guys heard out there, just understand. I mean, Chris Lytle made $800 or $500 in his UFC debut. He made $2,000 to fight Robbie Lawler in a main card fight. Think about that for a minute. $2,000. There's not one fighter that enters the UFC nowadays that makes $2,000. That's just a given. They make 8 and 8 to 10 and 10 to start. So look at the progression, Chris, just from 2004 when you fought Lawler till current date. I mean, it's night and day. One to say it's only going to get more from here. And here's another thing people don't understand. On a business perspective, I hear boxing a lot. I've even heard some people go as far as, kind of comparing, well, why don't they make what the NFL players make? Here's the reality. The NFL isn't owned by one individual or 3 individuals in this case. There's 30 different owners, 31 different owners, and that's majority that are part of the league. And each one of those owners have at least 5 or 6 minority owners underneath that. On top of things, you look at what the NFL brings in on an annual basis. They bring in money for TV deals, whether it be local or national. They bring in commercial advertising for the Super Bowl alone will run you. Dan, I think we figured out it was $1 million to $10 million an ad. I mean, so you look what they bring in for that. They bring in revenue for every T-shirt, hat, jersey, koozie, bandana, whatever merchandise you have. They bring in money for that. The UFC brings in revenue really from a handful of things. What sponsors they have, that's one. 2, some of the casinos I think have, a little bit of money factor backing it up. But mainly 3, the pay-per-view and the gates. So we're talking a wide spectrum of difference on what the UFC brings in versus what's brought in by the NFL. I think it's fair to say, Chris, Dan, and Dan, I'll throw this to you. I think the NFL brings more on Super Bowl weekend than the UFC does in a year. And I'm not being unrealistic by saying that, am I?
Well, you're probably onto something there. And, I mean, Chris, all your points are great, too. And, the other thing we talked about, Jay, and I think we all share the same opinion on this, it's a 10-year sport when you think about it, probably operating in the black. Eventually this company blew up. But, I mean, when Chris first came in, who knows at the UFC, they were probably still working in the red trying to build this business. So, realistically, when you look at it, you got about probably a 10-year profit margin going into the UFC right now. So it's a very, very young sport. And when you think about it, what it has, Jay, I think you touched on it, it has evolved to a point now where, like Chris said, it's $500 when he first came in. And, you got $1,800 or $2,200 to fight probably one of the better fights ever in UFC history, arguably, whatever. And the thing about it is now you come in at 8-8. If you're an Ultimate Fighter, you can come in, I think it's like 15-15. So I think it's done well. And also we talked about venues. The NFL, you get 8 games a year, and then if you happen to make it into the playoffs, you can get upwards of 12 games between preseason. So at 100,000 people or at 70,000 people, obviously the revenue shares are way different than what they are in the UFC when you can only pack a venue once a month or twice a month at a pay-per-view event and only put 20,000 people in there. So you can just do the simple beer math is what I say, and it just doesn't equate.
Chris, what's your intake and for thoughts on this discussion, so to speak?
Pardon me?
What's your thoughts on it? I mean, the whole NFL, people that compare it with the NFL to, what the NFL brings in versus what the UFC brings in annually. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
Well, I think one of the difficult things is, we're not 100% sure on exactly a lot with what the UFC is doing. I mean, their books aren't quite as open. I know they say right now fighter payout is 10% of total revenues. That might be true, and it was 8, so it's going up. But we don't know their total expenses. I mean, what if their expenses are pretty close to their total revenues? We don't know what exactly the expenses are, so it's really hard for us to make an accurate, judgment. I know everybody thinks Dana White goes around and throws money up in the air and rolls around and has money fights. I don't know what they think. They think he's just, super greedy doing whatever. Which I'm sure he does have a lot of money, but I mean, rightfully so, he deserves it. But I don't think he's, intentionally restricting people from getting money so that he can just, go buy another yacht or whatnot. So we don't really know their expenses. I think we have a little bit better gauge on what the NFL is doing and whatnot. We also have to look, how long has the NFL been around compared to how long has the UFC been around? Talk to some of the NFL players from the 70s. They had part-time jobs, or they had jobs in the off-season, some of them. So they weren't making the money they are now either. And that sport had been around for a long time back then. That's been around for a long time. So, we're not where we need to be right now, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. You can't just all of a sudden jump up and be everybody making $100,000 a year and everything's great. That's just not the reality of the situation. The sport is not there yet. If you try to do that, I think you will. What happens if you try to do all this and everybody tries to, mandatory make the UFC pay more, all of a sudden the UFC's out of business? What are these fighters going to do? Nobody's going to have a living. Nobody's going to have a career. All the sponsorships going to be. I mean, it'd be a nightmare if you give people what they want. It would not work out for everybody. I guarantee you that.
Absolutely not. And I mean, now granted, I agree with your assessment that if the UFC goes under, there's a lot of paddles and no boats, so to speak, for lack of a better term. Granted, and this goes against GSP's lack of with the monopoly avenue that he's claiming exists. Keep in mind, if there's a monopoly, you've got Bellator, which is owned and operated by Viacom. Okay, say what you will about Bellator. You and I both have our own individual opinions on how they do contract there. But Bellator, Viacom's got money. Viacom's not chump change by any means. And then there's World Series of Fighting, who's on the up. They've actually got an event tonight. So, I mean, there's definitely no monopoly. I do agree, though, if the UFC went down, I'm not so sure that World Series of Fighting and Bellator could carry, dare I say, carry that same load, Chris. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I understand exactly what you're saying. And I've heard that talk before, people talking about the monopoly and, they need to do something. That's just people's ignorance on understanding what a monopoly is and whatnot. They don't have a monopoly. They're the biggest, and that's without a doubt. Without a question, they are the best organization for mixed martial arts in the world. However, when you're talking about boxing, that's huge. I mean, they don't understand. I mean, Bellator is a legitimate competitor. I mean, they're not anywhere near the UFC level, and they're not going to be. I don't even know if they want to be. But, I mean, they are an alternative, and they have a lot of money behind them. So you can't really claim monopoly. People who might be doing that, they just think this isn't fair for me, and they can look at it from their little angle and why it's not fair. And I'm sorry, they do have the negotiating tools. I told you about how when I tried to say, I'm not going to fight for you for $2,000, and they said, okay, fine. Thanks for fighting for us, Chris. And I thought about it for a minute, and I called him back, and I said, yeah, I will fight for you for 2000. I mean, that's just a reality situation. That has nothing to do with the monopoly. That's just a situation that I'm in, and they hold the power. That's what it is. I mean, it's not. People think that everything has to be fair. I don't understand. Life's not fair. I'm not really sure whoever said it was misinforming somebody. So, I can't disagree more if someone says the UFC is a monopoly.
Now, Dan, you work with fighters of all sorts, with the Enlisted Nine Fight Company. I think you can agree with me that, and Chris, that there's no more of a monopoly than there is in the NFL or on radio programs, right? I mean, what are your thoughts on this GSP claims of monopoly?
I think that Chris and you have touched on it, many a times already, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there are some fighters actually that their goal, every fighter, obviously the big dreams of grandeur is to be in the UFC. We all agree with that. But some of my fighters, I mean, some of them are in the CFFC, some are in, Legacy, some of them fight down in World Series of Fighting, with Chad, and Colton fights in the UFC. But I think any fighter works hard to get that contract in a big name. And I think all of those organizations, they all serve their purpose. Some people might say it's a farm league, or some people might say it's like the Canadian Football League. But the bottom line, there's very good competition in all those, promotions. So I don't know that the goal is always to get to the UFC, that fast. Some guys want to get down there and cut their teeth, like Chris talked about earlier with his fighter. And I think they're getting a little bit more TV time now. So I think the monopoly's kind of misstated, I guess it's misstated in a sense by those other fighters that are saying that now, because there's 4 or 5 other good promotions out there that you can make your name in.
Absolutely. And that number's growing. I mean, believe me, that number's growing. By the end of 2014, 2015, we may see another major player out there. I mean, MMA, the name of MMA as a whole is growing, and believe me, more people are trying to get on board, and I can't help but believe that's because of the model that the UFC set and the proven track record of success that they're having, especially over the last 8 to 10 years. Now, speaking of success, one name that's brought the UFC some money that they had some success with is former UFC heavyweight champion, current WWE superstar Brock Lesnar. Now, I posted something on the Enlisted Nine Fight page the other day, gentlemen, about the possibility of Lesnar coming back. Dana White said it's a probability, very possible. We hear rumors all the time about Brock's return to the octagon. The response was generally overwhelmingly negative about the idea. A lot of people, are calling him fake wrestling, bringing up the Hell in a Cell, all the stuff that he does in the WWE. And the fact that he lost his last 2 fights. Here's my simple thoughts on this. Number one, Brock Lesnar did 2 things exceptionally well. Number one, competed against top competition. Because let's be honest, you look at his level of competition just in the UFC alone, because that's where he fought a majority of his fights. Name me the easy fight he had. I mean, his debut in the UFC, his second fight overall, was against Frank Mir. That's never an easy fight. His third fight was against Heath Herring, and it all went uphill from there. Realistically, the only easy fight that man had was his MMA debut against Min Soo Kim, who, by the way, is an Olympic silver medalist in judo, so it's not like he's a can off the sideline somewhere, or some bum in a bar, that's drinking beer saying, I train UFC. I mean, this guy has fought legit competition from start to finish. And he did it at basically 60-70%. What would have Brock done had diverticulitis not struck him down twice? Number two, I mean, he sells tickets. And at the end of the day, you know this, Chris, you're a promoter. You do promotion up in Indiana. What's the most important thing as a promoter? Putting butts in seats or pay-per-view buys, correct? And who does it better than Brock?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And that's people haven't really realized this. 2 of the biggest pay-per-view sellers of all time are not with the UFC right now. I mean, they're not going to do anything in 2014. GSP and Anderson Silva are not there. That's a huge problem for the UFC right now. There's only so many people they can put on who can carry a pay-per-view card. I mean, you have John Jones, Cain Velasquez, Chael Sonnen, Ronda Rousey. I mean, look at it. Ronda's fighting very, very soon after her last fight. Do you think she wants to? I imagine they're probably saying, hey, we need you to fight. We have a big hole. We have a lot of gaps we have to fill. I would be shocked if Brock doesn't come back, because I'm going to guess they're going to make him an offer he's not going to want to refuse, because they need someone who can sell that many pay-per-views, I'm not really sure who else they could throw in there who's going to do that. But people are going to want to see him fight. If you like him or you dislike him, you think he's great, or you want to see him get knocked out, people are going to pay to see that. And that's as a promoter, I've learned this, is I don't care if people like the guy or hate the guy. I care if people come to pay to see the guy. So that's what matters to me, and I'm pretty sure that's what matters to the UFC. I mean, you want people to be legitimate fighters, and he is. He is. Say what you will, I'm not going to say he is the best in the world, because I don't think he is, not at all. But do I think he's not only a fighter? It's not all about fighting, it's also about entertaining, and he is a very good entertainer. So I think people will want to see him fight. They will pay to see him fight, and if you have that, they're going to make him fight. Now, I mean, not going to force him to fight, but they're going to make it to where he is going to fight.
Now, Dan, I'm going to throw another avenue at you here. A lot of people, the angle they're at, and going along with what Chris said, a lot of people are saying, oh, he lost his last two fights. Who's going to tune in? Different sports, but I'm going to give you an example. Mike Tyson, lost his last two fights to Danny Williams and Kevin McBride, gentlemen who wouldn't last one round in their prime with Tyson, right? Tyson would have manhandled both of them probably in under 2 minutes in his prime at his best. He got smoked by both of them. If Mike Tyson came out of retirement tomorrow and said, you know what, I'm fighting February 28th against anybody, and you throw any random name out there, it doesn't matter who, I guarantee you Mike Tyson would draw pay-per-view buys that boxing hasn't seen in years. I'm going to throw the same angle out there with Brock Lesnar. Yeah, he lost his last two fights. Absolutely, we're not denying that. He got knocked out in his last two fights by Cain Velasquez and Alistair Overeem, and darn near got knocked out by Shane Carwin in his third, which eliminates the talk that he can't take a punch, but that's a different debate for a different show. I mean, Dan, if he came back, even despite two losses, do you agree with me? I mean, do you think that people would still tune in to watch him in spite of those two losses, or do you think that they would tune out?
Oh, absolutely, they're going to watch it. See, Chris, you hit it right on the head. The guy is an entertainer. So what does Brock Lesnar bring to the UFC? In my personal opinion, he brings a lot of fan base that the UFC normally wouldn't have. He forged those relationships out there in his other career with wrestling. But here's the deal. This guy he was basically essentially thrown to the wolves, in my opinion. He really wasn't even refined as a fighter. Look who he fought. So Carwin back then was a contender, as we know. We know Frank Mir was a big-time contender, champion. And then he fought Velasquez. I mean, this guy never had an easy fight. Even Heath Herring coming from Pride, he was a lot of hype coming into the UFC. So how can anybody say this guy doesn't belong in the UFC? I don't understand. Do I like his ways? Well, I say he's a great fighter. I'm not going to say he's the best, but I'm going to say he's competitive. And with Cain being injured, I think he puts that Band-Aid on that pay-per-view issue for the next couple months if they can get him back. I mean, that's just my personal opinion on that.
And there are still plenty of fights out there for him. I mean, Josh Barnett, that'd be an interesting fight. Even a rubber match with Mir, if Mir beats Overeem, that's So there are fights to be had involving Brock Lesnar, and I just think, to me, if the UFC can get him back, I think it's good because it's more pay-per-view buys. Which, by the way, everybody talks about money. That leads back to our original discussion. More pay-per-view buys means more money for the fighters. So I don't see the harm nor the foul. And I just laugh at the fact that people can't get over that he was a former professional wrestler or is currently in the WWE. Look, this isn't Ric Flair or Hulk Hogan or, Andre the Giant coming in there and fighting with no background in combat sports. Brock Lesnar was a very highly accomplished wrestler at the University of Minnesota in the high school ranks. I mean, national champion wrestler. The guy is a freak athlete who never played football higher than the high school level, was a varsity letter winner in North Dakota in football, wound up walking onto the Minnesota Vikings and making their preseason roster, which says volumes about his athleticism. I mean, this guy's not this isn't your Hulk Hogan, your Ric Flair type wrestler. This guy is a legitimate athlete who had success, on the wrestling mat and to some degree just making a roster in professional football. Now, speaking of professional football, move on to our weekly NFL chatter as it is again championship weekend. The recap, though, from last week, Chris, disappointing game, obviously, for the Indianapolis Colts. They're beaten emphatically by the New England Patriots by a score of 43-22. It was really the LeGarrette Blount show as Tom Brady throws 0 touchdowns in a game. Ironically, the Patriots are now 4-0 when Brady doesn't throw a touchdown. That's interesting. But where do you think things went wrong for the Colts in this one?
I mean, right from the very first series, if you were watching the game, Andrew Luck had a very tough game. He threw too many interceptions. Right at the very first series, I think his third play of the game was a pickoff, almost for a touchdown. He knocked him out to 2, but it was all downhill from there. I mean, that being said, I think he threw 3 interceptions. He really showed. He showed me that, I think he is just how good he is. He's going to be a great quarterback in the future. He has a lot of potential, but he's not quite there yet. He really showed me that, once again, Peyton Manning didn't win a game in the playoffs for the Colts for 6 years, and everybody talks about how great he was. This is his second year. I guess I kind of got caught up in the hysteria about how good this guy is, and I kind of realized he's not quite where he needs to be. Not only that, we don't have quite the tools around him. I'd like to see if you threw him at Denver right now, how good would Andrew Luck be doing with that team? I think he'd do better than he has been with the Colts. But I just think that all that being said, halfway through the third quarter, I look and we're only down, 7 points. I was pretty happy to say, hey, we have a chance here. And then, of course, another Andrew Luck interception. But, we had trouble keeping the ball on offense, and we had no answer for their run game. I was shocked they had 6 rushing touchdowns against us, went for 218 yards. I don't know who you're going to beat when you give up 6 rushing touchdowns, give up 218 yards on the ground.
No, and it's not like, and with due disrespect to LeGarrette Blount, not intended here, it's not like they're giving up 6 rushing touchdowns to Ray Rice or to, LeGarrette Blount a good halfback? Is he that kind of halfback? No, and to me that proved a glaring hole. And I think the 2 biggest holes Indianapolis needs to fill in the offseason are a number 2 receiver, or at least a complement to T.Y. Hilton. I think Eric Decker's a name that really would look good in Indianapolis, getting the ball lobbed to him by Luck. And 2, they need to find a run stuffer because, frankly, like you said, you're not going to win too many games when you give up 218 yards and multiple touchdowns like they did. So that's the 2 biggest things I think they need to fill in the offseason. Dan, what were your thoughts on the game between the Colts and the Patriots?
I think if I was an Indianapolis fan right now, I'd be pretty excited for the future. I mean, you're going to see the changing of the guard here with Manning going out, and Tom Brady. And I think when you look at quarterbacks and what they've been able to do this quick in their NFL career, I think Andrew Luck has more than proven himself. Obviously, it's no different than a fighter, like we talk about going into the octagon for the first time in the UFC. You're going to have a little issues out there. The moment's sometimes bigger than what you are. And but I think the way he came back in the third quarter, they kind of made it competitive. Yeah, he threw a couple bad interceptions, but you got to think this kid's only been around a couple of years. So if I was an Indianapolis fan right now, filled in a few gaps, I'd be pretty excited what the future holds.
Very high future. Very high future. Luck is he's done things in 2 years that most quarterbacks don't do in a career. I mean, as Chris succinctly pointed out, took Peyton Manning 7 years to win a playoff game. Luck did it in 2. And they also got a good running back there in Trent Richardson. They got Donald Brown, who's young. T.Y. Hilton's, only going to be in year 3. The future is very bright. Indianapolis is one of those teams that really, I think they're 1 or 2 pieces away from being elite, a team to look out for in the NFL. Speaking of elite teams, Denver picks up a win. They also suffer a loss, though. Now, first off, about the game itself, they win to 24-17. Really, Dan, Chris, this game was not as close as it seemed on scorecard. Denver, I think, Dan, I'll kick with you. I think they started with cruise control, went into cruise control in the third and fourth quarter, let the game be a little bit more competitive than it actually was.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think Denver needs to be very careful about that, too, because this team they're getting ready to play, it doesn't matter how you look at it. Tom Brady and the New England Patriots, they're going to be ready to play. And if they go ahead and take their foot off the gas this weekend, I think we're going to be in for a pretty high-scoring game, and I think New England could easily take that game if Denver gets caught sleeping.
So, Chris, what were your thoughts on the game between between the Broncos and the Chargers?
Well, obviously, it's like you're saying. The Broncos started off; they looked fantastic. I think maybe they did get a little bit caught up in, hey, we won this game, because the Chargers came back in the fourth quarter, and I thought that for a minute, hey, we might have a game here. They got down 1 touchdown, and then Denver's deep in their own territory, and it was 3rd and 17. I'm thinking they're going to get the ball back. And Denver did it a couple of times. Completed a pass on 3rd and 17, got a first down, had another third down, completed that. It just seemed like one of those plays doesn't go right. I was thinking that the Chargers were going to come back and tie it up, but Peyton Manning and his offense were able to pull out some pretty bad third downs and be able to close the game out. So once again, just like you said earlier, I don't think they're going to be able to do that this week. It's going to be very interesting to see. You have Tom Brady, who's not even really having to do much right now. Let's see what Denver does with a team against a good running game like that and a good quarterback.
Now, from the NFC angle of things, we saw both San Francisco and Seattle pick up victories. From the San Francisco perspective, they roughhoused the Panthers. Really, Carolina was never in that football game. Final score that one 23-10. Now, the Panthers, this is a red-hot team coming in, Chris and Dan, that they were 11-1 in their last 12, but for some reason they could never quite find a pace in this game. They could never gain their composure, their footing. I got to ask, what was a bigger factor in their performance this week? Was it the playoff inexperience, taking on a team that has had nothing but it in the last 2 years, or do you think it was just the fact that, quite bluntly, I mean, do you think that they were flat because they had that off week? They got the off week while they were hot.
I mean, personally, I feel like it was more just the fact that I think San Francisco is just a better team. Obviously the Panthers, in my opinion, really did a couple foolish things. D'Angelo Williams, one of their pivotal points in their game, he touched the ball 5 times the whole game. I mean, you're not going to win too many when one of your best players isn't getting the ball at all. That was crazy. Another thing that really defined the whole game for me is the 49ers. They give up. They're on their goal line. 7 possessions on the goal line. They didn't give up a touchdown. They gave up 3 points in 7 possessions. Right there on the goal line 7 times. You get 3 points out of it. That was unbelievable to me. I remember thinking, you're not going to beat too many people if you get the ball right there and you end up with 3 points. So 49ers D look phenomenal. I just think they're a better team. They got a great front line right there, and they're going to be hard to beat.
Now, about the Seattle Seahawks New Orleans game, obviously that one a bit interesting. It was a Marquise Colston gaffe in the punt return or on the kickoff return where he decided to forward lateral the pass, which took them out of contention, ended the football game, and 2 missed Shane Graham field goals really what cost them. But my question to you, gentlemen, Seattle, and we'll talk a little bit about their success at CenturyLink Field since 2004 when it opened. But, what about that stadium gives the Seahawks such a distinct advantage? I mean, Chris, you fought in Indianapolis against Matt Sarah. We'll throw this perspective out there. What about being in front of your hometown crowd or your home field makes you so much better? And why are the Seahawks just so exceptional at it?
Well, I think in these sports, people don't really understand the emotional factor that can come into play. And when you have everybody cheering for you, when I was there, I'm hearing people chanting my name, chanting Lytle, Lytle, Lytle. You not only want to please them, but it gives you a little bit of extra, I don't want to say energy, maybe it puts a little bit more adrenaline in your system. It really gives you a little bit of extra oomph that makes you want to compete better, wants to hit the guy harder, and wants to keep going. It just adds to the overall environment, and it affects you mentally and physically. So there is definitely something. I looked it up, and I saw in the playoffs, out of about 400 games, the winning team has the home team has won 293, and they've lost 140. So playoffs, it really comes into play. The home field advantage is actually an advantage. So it's definitely a distinct advantage for whoever's at home to have that home crowd behind them cheering. I think it helps with the adrenaline. It just gets everybody in the right frame of mind and ready to win.
Dan, what are your thoughts on Seattle's home field? I mean, the proficiency they have in CenturyLink Field. Just to give a quick numbers breakdown here. Seattle now 16-1 overall since 2012. Have not lost a playoff game at CenturyLink Field since 2004. 16-1 overall. What are your thoughts on this dominance that Seattle seems to have at home? I mean, they seem to perfect at it, correct? When it comes to winning at home games when it counts.
Well, that stadium, if you look at I don't know if you ever get into the infrastructure of how things are built, but that stadium was definitely built for sound. And then up in the top, you can hear all those metal bleachers up there. So I guess it's broken like every sound record, and it's got all the false start records in the NFL. So I think that has a big advantage there. But at the same time, I think that Seattle just happens to be a great football team right now over the last many years. and the stadium just gave them that much more. Because, Arrowhead had the same situation there for the longest time. It was a loud stadium. But I just think that they're just a great football team. They're well coached, and I think the stadium just happens to be just icing on the cake, I guess.
Good points by Dan O'Brien. And you're tuned in to Full Note Punches Radio here on the Tan Talk Radio Network, AM 1340 and its sister affiliates. Feel free to give us a call. We got about 10 minutes left at 727-441-3000 or 866-826-1340. Going to break down the games that we got coming up tomorrow. We'll start off, since we're on this topic right now, with the Seahawks versus the 49ers. Now, this game, again, as I mentioned, Seattle has such a distinct advantage at home. With the 16-1 record since 2012, their only loss coming to the Arizona Cardinals in really a mop-up game earlier this year. They've especially, though, gentlemen, had a stranglehold over San Francisco in the last 2 years. Now, at home, in Colin Kaepernick's career, Kaepernick is 0-2 in Seattle. The Seahawks have beaten him twice, and they've outscored them 71-16. So, I mean, obviously, Seattle has an even bigger home field advantage playing against San Francisco here at home because they've dominated them in both two games, and they're 3-0 at home under against Jim Harbaugh since he took over. So, I mean, do you gentlemen see, Dan, to kick us off, do you see this game going any differently? I mean, do you see Seattle picking up a win here again and going to 4-0 against Harbaugh, 3-0 against Kaepernick at home, or do you see Kaepernick and Harbaugh pulling another one out on the road?
I think at this particular time, 49ers have an outstanding road record. Seattle has an outstanding home record. So, but I think there's a couple factors in the game that are very important. I think the Sherman-Crabtree matchup is pivotal in this game because otherwise, if that doesn't happen, that right there could be the difference maker because of the way that, these formations are built and the defenses that they play. But I will tell you, in my personal opinion, I think Vernon Davis and Gore have to have probably their best game because I think Sherman will shut Crabtree down, and we'll see where it goes from there. But I can't make a decision on it. The only thing I'll say, it's less than 39, and it's a field goal.
Yeah. You got to come off the fence there, Dan. I mean, you're on enlisted 9 saying you went 4-0 against Chris last week because even though it was not on record on any site, so you can't do that to us this week, man. You got to make a pick here. I will go on the record right now. I will say Kaepernick gets the monkey off his back in Seattle, and 49ers win within 3, and the game will have no more than 39 points between the two of them. Fair enough. Chris, what are your thoughts on this prediction, the breakdown? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I'm going to have to agree with him on this one. I was kind of hoping he was going to say Seattle because I had decided before I was going to go with the 49ers. I know a lot of people are saying exactly that. They're saying that, Seattle, they've won 7 playoff games in a row at home and whatnot, but they also have to look at the 49ers have won the last 3 road games in the playoffs. And just watching the last week's games, I definitely feel that the 49ers defense is going to be the difference in this game. I don't think they're going to be able to score on them like they have in the past. Seattle's been pretty dominant. I think they have probably one of the best top 2 or 3 running backs in the league with Marshawn Lynch, but I think he's going to have a difficult time of it this week. Both of the quarterbacks are very unconventional in how their approach is at the game. It's going to be very loud there, but I definitely think that 49ers are a better team all around. They got a better front 7. I think they're going to pull out the victory. It's going to be very close, though.
Now, one point I want to throw out there to you, gentlemen, is both the games where Seattle was defeated by, or earlier this year, I should say, the game where Seattle defeated the 49ers so advantageously. I think that's a word. I hope it is. But the first game where Seattle beat them in Seattle, CenturyLink Field, San Francisco did not have Anquan Boldin and Michael Crabtree on the field. That could play a big factor because having Crabtree there along with Boldin, that opens up the offense and gives Frank Gore more time to run. They don't suspect the run that's happening. Throw Vernon Davis into the mix. That's a pretty good 3-headed monster at receiver. I'm going to play the opposite side of that card. Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, and by the way, Boldin was a beast last week. He had 136 yards on 8 catches. That guy, he's the real deal. I think he will be a big factor. Go ahead.
I agree. And I'm going to take the opposite side of the spectrum, though. I'm going to go with Seattle, man. I mean, yeah, Russell Wilson's had he looked a little bit frazzled last week. He sort of, I don't want to say coasted down the stretch, but he hasn't been at his best. But I'm a firm believer in that home field advantage. And let me tell you, Seattle's track record is just I think Seattle's going to the Super Bowl. I'm going to make the pick with the Seahawks. I'm with you, gentlemen, though. I think it's going to be under 39 points. I think it's going to be decided by under a touchdown. I'm going to play the other side of the fence, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going with Seattle here. Now, about 6 minutes left. Real quick topic discussion on this one. Russell Wilson, Colin Kaepernick. Obviously, this weekend's game, you've got a great set of matchups. You've got the current, the here and now, the legends of today versus the legends of tomorrow. Could Colin Kaepernick versus Russell Wilson turn out to be this generation's version of Tom Brady and Peyton Manning? Dan, what do you think?
I will tell you, in my unlearned opinion, I will say that there is no way that's going down. If you look at the numbers that Kaepernick has been throwing up, he is not the future. Now, if you say Russell Wilson down the road with maybe Andrew Luck, I might buy into that. But Kaepernick, he is not putting up big numbers at all. He's a winner, obviously, but look who's the supporting cast around him. You threw Andrew Luck on the 49ers right now, I think you're looking at something special. Not that you're not already in Indianapolis, but I'm not willing to go out there and say that this is the future at all.
What do you think, Chris?
I think it's difficult. Anytime you have quarterbacks who primarily, one of their main things is scrambling and the ability to run, that they don't make it in the NFL. I mean, they do for a while, but it seems like the longevity is missed. It's not there. I agree. I think they're both unconventional winners, which is what makes it such a fascinating matchup you have with this game right here. But if you can't learn to just be a pocket passer at some point, I think you're going to have difficulty in the NFL. So I'm not real sure if this is if this is the future. It's going to be a totally different game than I'm used to watching. So I have to admit, though, I love watching Kaepernick style. I love watching Wilson too. I think they're both very unconventional winners, but they're unconventional for a reason. I just don't see that being able to hold up in the NFL for too many years.
And again, you guys bring up another thing, unconventional. Again, the interesting perspective, at least, is you've got two totally unconventional quarterbacks versus two, dare I say, old school. I mean, would you call Manning and Brady two old school quarterbacks, the ones that do it by the book, which is what Andrew Luck does? Go ahead.
Absolutely, I would.
Awesome. Now, speaking of which, we got about 3 minutes left. Real quick, we got what could very well wind up being the final playoff meeting between Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. What just a great rivalry this has been. Two of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Chris, real quick, lead us off. How essential is this Patriots-Broncos game? How essential is a win for Peyton Manning in this, and the Super Bowl win to cement him possibly as the greatest quarterback of all time? Do you think it's needed? Do you think he needs to win this game and a Super Bowl, another Super Bowl, to be considered the GOAT of quarterbacks?
I think he does. I think otherwise people are going to look at him as maybe one of the best regular season quarterbacks of all time, but not one of the best playoffs. If you look at his playoff record, it's not very good. He did win it with the Colts one time, but they were number one in the league so many years, it's going to be difficult if he doesn't get this done, because he's had a great team with a lot of great defense now, great receivers, great running backs, and if he can't get it done here, people are going to say, well, there's always going to be that thought that he really wasn't the guy who could win the big game. And to be honest with you, I'm going to go with the Patriots actually winning this game. I think he has the number one running offense versus the number one running defense, and I think the Patriots, with that many weapons, with the running and with Brady, I think they're going to be able to pull off a victory in that cold weather that Manning doesn't like very well.
Absolutely. Dan, what are your thoughts? I mean, what are your thoughts on what Manning needs to do? Does Manning need this win and a Super Bowl win to cement himself as the greatest quarterback of all time, and what's your prediction on the game?
Well, I'll just start. Chris hit it right on the head. He's going to go down as the greatest regular season quarterback, much like Dan Marino. And but when it gets into the playoffs, you have a 10-11 record, and it just doesn't. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's the first ballot, but I just don't know if you could ever compete with a guy like Tom Brady and Coach Belichick that have gone to 5 Super Bowls, potentially 6 this year. But my predictions on this, it's not going to be that cold, supposedly. It's going to be like 63 degrees in Denver. So I think the glove comes off Manning. I think Manning is his year to get the Denver Broncos to the promised land. So I'll go ahead and say it's about a 54-point game, and I'll say that Denver wins by 7.
My real quick prediction: I'm going to go with the New England Patriots to pick up the win. I think Brady and the newfound running game of the Patriots will be enough to pick up the win. That'll wrap it up for this week. Omaha, Pull No Punches Radio, brought to you by the City of Omaha. I had to do it one time in the show. Hey, for my tag team partners, Chris Lights Out Lido and Dan O'Brien, we will talk to you next Saturday here on the Pull No Punches. Pull No Punches Radio, powered by Enlisted Nine Fight Company, and brought to you by the Tan Talk Radio Network. Good Saturday, everybody.
As I could to get away from the loneliness under the roof. I remember the day when you said your goodbyes.
WTAN, Clearwater, Tampa Bay. WDCF, Dade City, Tampa Bay. WZHR, Zephyr Hills, Tampa Bay.